The letter lay upon the polished mahogany of her father's desk like a death sentence. Seraphina Beaumont stared at the crisp fold of parchment, the forbidding slash of black wax stamped with the crest of a wolf and winter thorn, the seal of the Duke of Blackwood. A man whose name was a whisper in the London drawing-rooms, a ghost story told in hushed tones, a man of immense wealth, immense power, and a grief so profound it had turned him to stone. A widower. Her father, Baron Beaumont, a man whose usual boisterous confidence had been leached from him over months of quiet desperation, could not meet her eyes. He traced the rim of an empty brandy snifter, his knuckles white. The scent of financial ruin was a palpable thing in the room, more cloying than the stale pipe smoke and old leather. It smelled of dust and decay, of a legacy crumbling. "It is the only way, Seraphina," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp. "Lord Albright has called in the last of my notes. The shipping venture. It was a disaster. We are undone, undone." The word was so simple, so final. It meant the loss of their London house, the dismissal of loyal staff who had served their family for generations. It meant the end of the Beaumont name as anything other than a cautionary tale whispered over cards and tea. Seraphina felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones, a feeling she had grown accustomed to as the shadows lengthened over their house. She had watched the fine silks of her gowns be replaced with sensible wool, seen the good silver vanish piece by piece, and endured the pitying glances of society. But this was a finality she had not prepared for. "The Duke of Blackwood?" she asked, her own voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to another woman in another, less desperate life. "I have heard stories." "He requires a duchess," her father said, finally looking at her, his eyes pleading. "He needs a mother for his child. A respectable name to manage his estate. He is not looking for a love match, Seraphina. He has made that abundantly clear." He pushed the letter across the desk. It was not a proposal. It was a contract, a business arrangement outlined in stark, emotionless prose by the Duke's solicitor. The Beaumont debts would be settled in their entirety. A generous allowance would be provided for her parents to live out their days in comfort at their country estate. In return, she, Lady Seraphina Beaumont, would become the Duchess of Blackwood. She would take on the running of his formidable household and, most importantly, provide a maternal influence for his motherless daughter. The letter mentioned the girl, Lady Alara, only once, a clinical footnote in a transaction of human lives. There was no mention of affection, of companionship, of any of the tender hopes a young woman, even one as pragmatic as Seraphina, might secretly harbor for her own marriage. It was a trade, her life for her family's salvation. She thought of her mother, her gentle constitution already strained by their fall from grace. She thought of her father, a proud man utterly broken. She thought of the life she had once imagined for herself, perhaps not a grand passion, but a union of quiet respect and shared warmth, a garden of her own to tend, children whose laughter would fill the halls, all of it dissolving like mist. "He is a cold man, they say," Seraphina said softly, her fingers hovering over the letter, not yet touching it. "They call him the Iron Duke." "He is a man who has suffered a great loss," her father corrected, a flicker of defensiveness in his tone. "His first wife, the circumstances were tragic. It is said he has not been the same since, but he is a man of honor, Seraphina. His word is his bond. You will be safe. You will be a duchess. You will want for nothing except warmth, nothing except a kind word, a shared glance, a hand to hold in the dark." The unspoken words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. She knew this was not a choice. Her father's posture, the hollows beneath his eyes, the slight tremble in his hand, they all told her that this was the end of the line. Refusal was not an option. With a resolve that felt like a shard of ice forming in her chest, she picked up the letter. The parchment was heavy, expensive. The ink was a severe, uncompromising black. She read the solicitor's words, each one a nail in the coffin of her girlhood dreams. She would be a figurehead, a household manager, a glorified governess with a title. "I will do it," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. She folded the letter with precise, deliberate movements. "For the family." Her father let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound relief it was almost a sob. He came around the desk and took her hands, his own cold and clammy. "You are a good daughter, Seraphina. The best of daughters. You have saved us." She did not feel like a savior. She felt like a sacrifice laid upon a cold stone altar. And as she looked past her father's shoulder, out the window at the grey, weeping London sky, She had the distinct premonition that she was about to be delivered into a winter from which she might never emerge. The first meeting was arranged to take place in the cold, impersonal offices of the Duke's solicitor. It was a deliberate choice, Serafina knew, designed to reinforce the nature of their arrangement. This was not a courtship. It was a negotiation. She dressed with calculated simplicity in a gown of deep blue wool, a color that spoke of sobriety and quiet dignity. Her only adornment was a small silver locket her mother had given her, its surface smooth and cool against her skin. Her maid, Martha, a woman whose loyalty had weathered the Beaumont family's financial storm, had arranged her hair with a steady hand, though her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "A duke he may be, my lady," Martha had muttered, pulling a pin tight, "but a man who summons his intended bride to a lawyer's office is a man with a heart of granite." Serafina had offered no reply. What was there to say? Martha was right. The Duke of Blackwood was already there when she was shown into the book-lined room. He stood by the window, a tall, severe silhouette against the weak afternoon light. He did not turn as she entered, and for a long moment the only sounds were the rustle of her skirts and the solicitor's nervous clearing of his throat. Then he turned, and Serafina felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. The whispers and rumors had not done him justice. He was not merely a cold man, he was a monument to coldness. His features were sharply cut, as if from unforgiving stone, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray, and they were utterly devoid of warmth. They looked at her, through her, seeing not a woman, but a solution to a problem. "Lady Serafina," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as devoid of inflection as his expression. It was the sound of a key turning in a long disused lock. "Your Grace," she replied, executing a flawless curtsy, her back straight, her chin high. She would not show him her fear. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing the tremor in her hands. He gestured to the chair opposite the one he intended to take, on the other side of a vast, imposing desk. The solicitor, Mr. Davies, scurried to his own seat, shuffling papers that already seemed decided. "I trust my solicitor has made the terms of our arrangement clear," the Duke began, foregoing any pretense of pleasantry. He did not sit, but remained standing, a towering, intimidating presence. "They are perfectly clear, Your Grace," Serafina said, her gaze steady. "Good." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Then allow me to add my own clarifications, so there can be no misunderstanding between us. This is to be a marriage in name and law only. Its purpose is threefold. First, it will provide my daughter, Ilara, with a duchess for a mother, a woman to oversee her education and social debut when the time comes. Second, you will assume the duties of the Duchess of Blackwood, managing the households in London and at the Blackwood estate. Third, should we be so fortunate, you will provide a male heir to secure the ducal line. Each point was delivered like a hammer blow, precise and brutal. Serafina felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks at the cold, clinical mention of an heir, but she kept her composure. "I understand my duties," she said quietly. He took a step closer to the desk, his winter-grey eyes seeming to bore into her very soul. He was searching for weakness, for some sign of feminine hysteria or romantic delusion. She would give him none. "Let me be more explicit, my lady," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more chilling in its quiet intensity. "My household has been without a mistress for 2 years. It has been shrouded in mourning. I require order, efficiency, and propriety. I do not require companionship. I do not require your counsel, and I most certainly do not require your affection." He paused, letting the cruel words hang in the air between them. The solicitor stared fixedly at a blot of ink on his desk, wishing himself anywhere else. "The private wing of the manor, the one that belonged to the late Duchess, will remain closed. Her memory is to be respected with silence. You will have your own rooms, your own staff, your own life within the bounds of your duties. My life, however, is my own. You will manage my household, you will be a mother to my daughter, but you will never enter my heart. That door is closed forever. Do you understand me?" The finality of his declaration was absolute. It was a wall of ice, and he was daring her to so much as touch it. Another woman might have wept or fled the room, but Serafina thought of her father's ruined face, of her mother's failing health. She thought of the word undone. She was the only thing holding her family together. Her heart was a small price to pay. She met his gaze without flinching, her own quiet dignity a shield against his brutal honesty. "I understand you perfectly, Your Grace. You have purchased a duchess. I will endeavor to be worth the price." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Surprise, or perhaps a grudging respect? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same impenetrable coldness. He gave a curt, sharp nod. "Very well, Davies will finalize the papers. The wedding will be in a fortnight, a small, private affair at the Blackwood Chapel." He turned then, without another word, and strode from the room, leaving behind a silence that was colder and heavier than before he had arrived. Seraphina remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her posture ramrod straight. She did not move until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded. Only then did she allow herself a single slow breath. She had made her bargain with the Iron Duke. She had sold her future to save her family's past. And as she sat there in the solicitor's cold, sterile office, she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow that she had just entered into her own private, gilded cage. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded landscape like a jagged piece of granite. It was not a home, it was a fortress, a testament to centuries of power and more recently to a deep and abiding grief. Its stone walls were dark with age and damp, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out over a wild, untamed park. As Seraphina's carriage rattled up the long, winding drive, a cold autumn rain began to fall, streaking the glass and blurring the imposing silhouette of her new prison. Martha, sitting opposite her, clutched a traveling blanket and stared out the window, her face a mask of grim foreboding. "It's a cheerless place, my lady," she whispered, as if the house itself might hear her. Seraphina said nothing. The house was a perfect reflection of its master, imposing, cold, and utterly unwelcoming. She had been the Duchess of Blackwood for a week spent in the Duke's London residence while the final arrangements for her removal to the country were made. The wedding itself had been a swift, bloodless affair in a dusty chapel, witnessed only by her parents and Mr. Davies. The Duke had spoken his vows in that same flat, emotionless tone he had used in the solicitor's office. He had placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch brief and cold as the metal itself. There had been no celebration, no kind words. After the ceremony, he had escorted her to the carriage that would take her to his London house, given her a stiff, formal bow, and departed for his club, leaving her on the steps of her new home alone. Now, as the carriage drew to a halt before the massive oak doors of Blackwood Manor, she felt that same profound sense of abandonment. The doors swung open, and a line of servants stood assembled in the grand, echoing entrance hall. At their head was a butler whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of solemn disapproval. And beside him, a woman in severe black silk, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. Seraphina knew instinctively that this must be Lady Beatrice, the Duke's widowed cousin, who, according to Mr. Davies, had been running the household since the late Duchess's death. The Duke was not there to greet her. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood," the butler announced, his voice booming unnaturally in the cavernous space. Lady Beatrice stepped forward, her smile a thin, brittle thing that did not reach her cold, assessing eyes. "Your Grace, welcome to Blackwood Manor. I am Lady Beatrice, the Duke's cousin. We are all so pleased to finally have you with us." The words were correct, but the tone was laced with something that felt distinctly like a warning. "Thank you, Lady Beatrice," Seraphina replied, her voice steady as she untied the ribbons of her bonnet. "It is good to be here." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The tour of the house was a chilling affair. Lady Beatrice pointed out the staterooms, the dining hall, the ballroom, all shrouded in dust covers, their gilded splendors muted and ghostly. A pervasive silence clung to the air, broken only by their footsteps on the marble floors and Beatrice's clipped proprietary narration. The house did not feel empty, it felt haunted, held captive by a memory that no one dared speak aloud. "The Duke is in his study," Beatrice said, gesturing vaguely down a long, dark corridor. "He does not like to be disturbed. His routine is fixed." The implication was clear, he was not to be approached. Finally, they ascended the grand staircase to the family apartments. Beatrice led her past a series of closed doors, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This, of course, is the master wing." She paused before a set of double doors at the end of the hall, which were noticeably darker and more ornate than the others. "And this was the late Duchess's wing. It has been kept locked since her passing, the Duke's orders." She said it with a strange sort of relish, as if guarding a sacred tomb. Seraphina merely nodded, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The locked wing, the physical manifestation of her husband's closed heart. Her own rooms were spacious and opulent, furnished with heavy dark wood and rich somber velvets. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the oppressive chill of the place. From her window she could see a vast, sprawling garden, or what had once been a garden. Now it was a tangled, overgrown wilderness of thorns and weeds, the stone paths cracked and obscured, the statues green with moss. It was a place of profound neglect, a mirror to the sorrow that saturated the very stones of the manor. It was in that first lonely dinner that she finally saw the child. The dining hall was a cavern of shadows, with a single candelabra lighting their small section of the impossibly long table. The Duke sat at the head, a formidable, silent presence. Lady Beatrice sat to his right, maintaining a low, one-sided stream of chatter about estate matters that he seemed to ignore completely. Serafina sat to his left, the distance between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm. Then a small figure appeared in the doorway, led by a stern-faced governess, Lady Elara. She was a tiny, delicate creature of about 6, with her father's dark hair but with wide, dark eyes that seemed too large for her pale, doll-like face. She was dressed in a simple white nightgown and clutched a small, worn-looking stuffed rabbit. She did not speak. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the floor, a ghost in her own home. "Elara, come and greet your new mother," the Duke said, his voice holding a forced, unnatural softness that was somehow more jarring than his usual cold tone. The child did not move. Her little shoulders tensed, and she shrank back against the governess's skirts. "She is shy," Lady Beatrice supplied quickly with another of her brittle smiles. "She has been sensitive since the tragedy. She will warm to you in time, I am sure." Serafina's heart went out to the small, silent girl. This was the true victim in this house of grief. She was the reason Serafina was here, the duty she had sworn to uphold. She gave the child a small, gentle smile, careful not to seem overwhelming. "Good evening, Lady Elara," she said softly. "That is a very handsome rabbit you have." Ilara's only response was to clutch the toy tighter and bury her face in the governess's dress. After a moment, the governess gave a stiff curtsy and led the child away to the nursery. The silence she left behind was heavier than before. The Duke's jaw was tight, a muscle clenching and unclenching. He stared at the spot where his daughter had been, his expression unreadable but for the deep pain that flickered for a brief, unguarded moment in his eyes. He did not look at Serafina for the rest of the meal. Later that night, as Serafina lay in her vast, cold bed, listening to the rain lash against the window panes and the mournful cry of the wind in the eaves, the full weight of her new reality settled upon her. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, mistress of a great house steeped in sorrow, wife to a man made of ice, and mother to a child who could not speak. It was a cold truce, a life of silent endurance. She had made her bargain, and now she had to live with it. As sleep finally claimed her, she dreamt of a tangled, thorny garden and a small locked door to which no one held the key. The days at Blackwood Manor bled into one another, a monotonous procession of grey skies and echoing silences. Serafina fell into a routine dictated by the cold formality of the household. She met with the housekeeper each morning, reviewed menus with the cook, and inspected the linen closets, performing the duties of a duchess with a quiet efficiency that gave Lady Beatrice no cause for complaint, though it did not stop the other woman's constant subtle attempts to undermine her authority. Beatrice would countermand a small order, or forget to pass on a message, or offer a backhanded compliment that was designed to remind Serafina of her place as a newcomer, an outsider. Serafina endured it all with a placid grace that seemed to infuriate her rival. Her true battle was not with Lady Beatrice. It was with the suffocating atmosphere of grief that permeated the very air she breathed. Her husband, the Duke, remained a distant, formidable figure. She saw him at dinner, where he ate in near total silence, and sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him crossing the great hall or riding out towards the moors, a solitary figure against the bleak landscape. He never sought her out. He never spoke a word to her that was not strictly necessary. He was a ghost in his own house, and she was the unwelcome guest. Her attempts to connect with Elara were met with the same silent, heartbreaking resistance. The child would retreat into herself whenever Serafina entered the nursery. She would turn her back, hiding her face, clutching her worn rabbit as if for protection. The governess, Miss Albright, a stern woman who seemed to take her cues from Lady Beatrice, did little to help, treating Serafina's presence as an intrusion. Feeling utterly isolated, Serafina found her only solace in the one place that seemed as broken and neglected as she felt, the derelict garden she had seen from her window. One crisp autumn morning, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the manor a moment longer, she wrapped herself in a thick cloak and went outside. Up close, the garden was even more chaotic than it had appeared from above. What had once been a magnificent rose garden, laid out in intricate patterns of stone and earth, was now a riot of thorns and weeds. The trellises had rotted and collapsed, and the marble benches were stained and half swallowed by ivy. At its center stood a dry, cracked fountain, its cherubic statue weeping green tears of moss. It was a place of profound sadness, a testament to years of neglect. But beneath the decay, Serafina could see the ghost of its former beauty. She could see the strong, resilient bones of the old rose bushes, choked, but not yet dead. A sudden, fierce resolve took hold of her. This, she decided, would be her domain. This would be her act of quiet rebellion. She would not try to breach the walls of the Duke's heart or force her way into the silent world of his daughter. Instead, she would bring this one small corner of Blackwood back to life. She returned to the house and sought out the head gardener, a grizzled old man named MacLeod, whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of an ancient oak. He was skeptical at first, his eyes wary. "The old Duchess's garden, that is," he said, wiping his hands on a burlap sack. "No one set foot in there for years. The Duke, he don't like it." "The Duke need not be troubled by it," Serafina said, her tone gentle but firm. "I will be doing the work myself. I only require a good pair of shears, some gloves, and your advice on which of the old roses might be salvageable." Something in her earnestness must have convinced him. He looked from her determined face to her soft, pale hands and gave a reluctant nod. "As you wish, Your Grace. The old briars have a wicked bite, mind you." And so her work began. Every day after her household duties were done, Serafina would change into a sturdy old dress and go out into the forgotten garden. The work was slow and arduous. She fought with tangled brambles that tore at her clothes and skin, her hands quickly becoming scratched and calloused despite the thick leather gloves. She spent hours on her knees, carefully, painstakingly clearing the weeds from around the base of the dormant rose bushes, her back aching with the effort. The staff watched her from the windows, whispering amongst themselves. Lady Beatrice made a point of remarking at dinner one evening, "Such a rustic hobby, Your Grace. One hopes you do not neglect your more important duties." The Duke, who had been staring into the middle distance, lifted his gaze. His eyes fell upon Serafina's hands, which she had been trying to hide in her lap. They were red and scored with fine white lines from the thorns. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual before returning to his plate. Serafina did not let it deter her. The physical labor was a balm to her troubled mind. Out in the garden, with the clean scent of earth in the air and the satisfying ache in her muscles, she could forget the cold silences of the manor. She was not the Duchess of Blackwood, the wife in a loveless contract. She was just a woman tending a garden, coaxing life from a neglected patch of earth. She also continued her gentle, one-sided courtship of Ilara. She began leaving small treasures for the child on the bench just outside the nursery door: a brightly colored autumn leaf, a smooth gray river stone, a small, perfect bird's feather. She never waited for a reaction, never pushed for a response. They were just small, silent offerings. One afternoon, as she worked near the edge of the garden closest to the house, she was aware of being watched. She glanced up towards the nursery window and saw a small face pressed against the glass. It was Ilara. The child watched her for a long time, her expression unreadable, before pulling back into the shadows of the room. It was the first sign of interest the child had shown, and it filled Serafina with a fragile, tentative hope. A few days later, a small twist occurred. While searching for a book on horticulture in the vast, dusty library, a room no one seemed to use, she stumbled upon a small hidden alcove behind a row of imposing leather-bound tomes. Tucked away on a shelf was a small volume bound in faded blue velvet. It was a journal. A delicate silver clasp, fashioned in the shape of a rose, held it shut. There was no key. On the first page, in elegant looping script, were the initials I.B. Isabel Blackwood, the late Duchess. Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. She felt a tremor of something akin to fear, as if she were trespassing on sacred ground. This was a piece of the woman whose ghost haunted the manor, whose memory held her husband and child in its thrall. Her first instinct was to put it back, to leave the past undisturbed as the Duke had commanded. But as she held the small locked book in her hands, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a pull towards the silent woman who had come before her. She slipped the journal into the pocket of her dress, her mind racing. This was a secret, a mystery, a piece of the puzzle that was Blackwood Manor. For now, it was a secret she would keep to herself. The first frost of winter arrived, silvering the overgrown lawn and putting a stop to Serafina's most arduous work in the garden. She had managed to clear the worst of the brambles and weeds, revealing the strong underlying structure of the beds and paths. It still looked desolate, but it was the desolation of winter sleep, not of decay. It was a garden, waiting for spring. Her relationship with the Duke remained unchanged. He was a remote, unapproachable presence, his politeness a shield more impenetrable than any overt anger could have been. Yet Serafina began to notice small things, cracks in the iron facade. She would sometimes look up from her needlework in the evenings to find his eyes on her, a strange, contemplative expression on his face, which he would quickly mask when he realized he was being observed. He never commented on her work in the garden again, but once, as she returned to the house, her cheeks flushed with cold and her cloak damp with melted frost, He was crossing the hall. He paused, his gaze dropping to the bundle of dormant rose cuttings she carried, which she intended to try and root indoors. "Those are from the old eglantine bush," he said, his voice quiet. "My mother planted it." It was the first personal thing he had ever said to her. Serafina was so taken aback she could only nod. "I'm hoping to save it. It seems to have strong roots." He held her gaze for a fraction of a second too long, a flicker of some deep buried emotion in his eyes, pain or memory or something else she couldn't name. Then he nodded curtly and continued on his way, leaving her standing in the cold hall, her heart beating a little faster. It was a tiny glimmer of warmth in the unending winter of their marriage, but it was enough to sustain her. Her quiet persistence with Ilara was also beginning to bear fruit, however small. The child no longer fled when Serafina entered the nursery. She would remain where she was, watching Serafina with her large, solemn eyes clutching her rabbit. Serafina started bringing her book and simply sitting in a chair by the fire, reading aloud in a soft, calm voice. She read fairy tales and simple poems, addressing the words to the room itself rather than directly to the child so as not to pressure her. One afternoon, as she read a story about a lost fawn, she felt a tiny tug on her sleeve. She looked down to see Ilara standing beside her chair, her small hand just barely touching the wool of Serafina's dress. It was the first time the child had initiated any physical contact. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She slowly, carefully closed the book and placed it in her lap. She did not look at Ilara, but instead gazed into the fire, giving the child the space to retreat if she wished. But Ilara did not retreat. She stayed where she was, her small fingers still resting on Serafina's sleeve. After a long moment, she pointed a tiny finger towards the window. Serafina followed her gaze. A single, late-season butterfly, a red admiral, was beating its wings against the cold glass, trapped. Without a word, Serafina rose, gently cupped the butterfly in her hands, and opened the window just enough to let it fly free into the cold, crisp air. She turned back to find Ilara watching her, a look of quiet wonder on her face. The child then turned and walked back to her corner. But she had shared something, a moment of connection. It was a beginning. Unseen from the doorway of his study across the hall, the Duke had witnessed the entire exchange. He had seen his silent daughter voluntarily approach this woman, his wife. He had seen Serafina's gentle patience, her quiet, undemanding kindness. He had watched as she freed the trapped butterfly, an act of simple compassion that resonated deep within his own frozen heart. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a warmth that was almost painful, a thawing around the edges of the ice that had encased him for so long. He stepped back into the shadows of his study before he could be seen, his mind in turmoil. This woman, this stranger he had brought into his home as a matter of convenience, was beginning to trouble his carefully constructed peace. She was quiet, she was resilient, and she was slowly, patiently, bringing life back to the dead and silent corners of his world. The small locked journal remained hidden in Serafina's dressing table. She had tried every small key she could find, but the silver rose clasp refused to yield. It sat there, a constant, silent reminder of the secrets this house still held. She would often take it out late at night, running her fingers over the soft, worn velvet, wondering about the woman who had filled its pages. Who was Isabel Blackwood? Was she the saint that Lady Beatrice alluded to? Or was she something more complex, more human? The journal held the answers, but it kept its silence as resolutely as the Duke himself. Serafina knew she was on the cusp of something, a change in the oppressive atmosphere of the manor. The ground was shifting beneath her feet, and she did not know if it would lead to solid ground or a terrifying abyss. The thaw, when it came, was heralded not by warmth, but by the icy grip of illness. A vicious winter fever swept through the nearby village, and despite the manor's isolation, it found its way through the gates. It struck the staff first, then with a terrifying swiftness it laid its hand on Ilara. Serafina was in the nursery, reading to the child when it began. Ilara, who had been sitting on the floor arranging a set of wooden blocks, suddenly listed to one side, her face pale and beaded with sweat. When Serafina rushed to her side, the heat radiating from the child's small body was alarming. Panic erupted in the household. The governess wrung her hands. Lady Beatrice, for all her airs of authority, seemed to lose her composure entirely, issuing a flurry of contradictory orders. The Duke was summoned from his study, his face a mask of stone that did not quite conceal the raw terror in his eyes. He knelt by his daughter's side, touching her forehead with a hand that trembled slightly. It was the most unguarded Serafina had ever seen him. "Send for Dr. Davies," he commanded, his voice tight with strain. "Immediately!" But the village doctor was miles away, and a fresh blanket of snow had made the roads treacherous. It would be hours, perhaps a day, before he could reach them. As Ilara's fever climbed, and she began to toss and turn in a restless, delirious sleep. Serafina felt her own quiet resolve solidify. Her mother had been a great believer in herbal remedies and had taught Serafina much about the art of nursing. While the household descended into chaos around her, she became a center of calm efficiency. "We need to bring the fever down," she stated, her voice cutting through Lady Beatrice's agitated fussing. "Martha, please bring basins of cool water and fresh linens. I want willow bark tea prepared. It must be steeped until it is strong." "Country nonsense," Lady Beatrice scoffed, her face pinched with disapproval. "We should wait for the doctor." "You will do more harm than good," the Duke, who had been staring at his daughter's flushed face, turned his piercing gaze on Serafina. She met it without wavering. "Your Grace, the fever is dangerously high. We cannot afford to wait. The remedies my mother taught me are gentle but effective. I will not harm her." He studied her for a long, tense moment, his eyes searching hers for any hint of doubt. He saw only a steady, compassionate competence. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it." It was all the authority she needed. Lady Beatrice fell silent, her lips thin with fury at being so readily dismissed. For the next 2 days and nights, Serafina did not leave the nursery. She sat by Ilara's bedside, patiently sponging the child's hot skin, forcing small sips of the bitter tea and cool water between her cracked lips. She changed the sweat-soaked linens, smoothed the tangled hair from the child's face, and spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, telling her stories, humming lullabies, promising her that she was safe. The Duke became a silent sentinel in the room. He would stand for hours by the window or sit in the chair opposite her, his face etched with worry, watching her every move. The forced proximity, the shared, terrifying vigil, created a strange and fragile intimacy between them. The usual barriers of formality and silence were eroded by their mutual fear for the child who lay between them. They did not speak much, but in the long, dark hours of the night, their shared glances held more communication than all the words they had exchanged in the months of their marriage. He saw her unwavering dedication, her exhaustion, her profound tenderness. She saw the raw, aching vulnerability beneath his iron control, the desperate love of a father terrified of losing his child. On the second night, the fever reached its crisis. Ilara began to cry out in her delirium, her small body thrashing. Serafina held her, murmuring reassurances when the child suddenly went rigid, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to come from a place deeper than the illness. "Falling," Ilara whimpered, the word a choked, terrified whisper. "No, falling." Serafina froze, the child's word echoing in the silent room. She glanced at the Duke. He stood by the hearth, his back to them, but she saw his shoulders tense, his hands clench into fists at his sides. He had heard it too. The word hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. What had the child seen? What memory was so terrifying that it could break through the fever's fog? Just before dawn, the fever broke. The crisis passed. Ilara fell into a deep, natural, healing sleep, her skin cool and damp, her breathing even and steady. Serafina, utterly spent, sagged with relief, resting her forehead against the edge of the small bed. A hand touched her shoulder. She looked up to see the Duke standing over her. His face was haggard in the grey morning light, but the stark terror in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, exhausted gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved her." He did not remove his hand. His touch was warm, solid, a startling point of contact in their cold, distant marriage. In that moment, they were not the Duke and his convenient Duchess. They were just two people, bound together by a shared ordeal and the fierce, protective love for a child. It was a temporary alliance, forged in crisis, but Serafina knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that something fundamental had shifted between them. The Iron Duke had allowed her to see the man beneath the armor, and the sight was both heartbreaking and devastatingly human. The wall between them had not crumbled, but a crack had appeared, and a fragile sliver of light was beginning to shine through. In the quiet days of Ilara's recovery, a new, tentative peace settled over Blackwood Manor. The shared crisis had irrevocably altered the dynamic of the household. Serafina's authority was no longer questioned. The staff, who had witnessed her tireless devotion, now looked upon her with a deep, quiet respect. Even Lady Beatrice was forced into a sullen silence, her power to undermine Serafina completely neutralized. Most significantly, the invisible wall between Serafina and the Duke had been breached. The silence between them was no longer cold and empty, but filled with an unspoken understanding. He sought her out, ostensibly to receive reports on Ilara's progress, but the conversations would drift. He would ask about the garden, about the book she was reading. He began to dine with her and a recovering Ilara in the less formal morning room, abandoning the cavernous, lonely dining hall. Ilara, too, was changed. The fever seemed to have burned away some of her fearful reserve. She was still silent, but she now sought Serafina's company, following her from room to room, sitting at her feet while she did her needlework. She would take Serafina's hand on their slow, careful walks in the corridors, her small fingers a trusting weight in Serafina's palm. The child's whispered, fevered word, falling, remained a troubling mystery in Serafina's mind. It was a piece of the puzzle she could not place, connected somehow to the locked wing and the profound sadness that still lingered in the house. One afternoon, a week after the fever had broken, the sun finally emerged, melting the last of the snow and bathing the dormant gardens in a pale, watery light. Serafina was sitting with Ilara in a sheltered corner of the terrace when the Duke appeared. "She is looking better," he said, his gaze soft as it rested on his daughter. "She is stronger every day," Serafina replied with a smile. He stood for a moment watching them. The light caught the silver threads at his temples, softening the harsh lines of his face. He looked less like a monument of grief and more like a man weary from a long battle. "Walk with me, Serafina," he said, his use of her given name a quiet intimacy that made her heart skip a beat. They strolled towards the rose garden, their footsteps making soft sounds on the damp gravel path. He was silent for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thoughtful. He stopped by the moss-covered fountain at the center of the garden Serafina had worked so hard to reclaim. "I have not been in this garden for over 2 years," he said, his voice low. "It was my first wife's favorite place. After she died, I could not bear to look at it. I ordered it left to ruin." He turned to face her, his gray eyes clear and filled with a deep, sorrowful light. "You have brought it back to life, just as you brought my daughter back. I only did what anyone would have done," she said softly. "No," he corrected her, his voice firm. "Not anyone. You stayed. You were patient. You were kind, when you had every reason not to be. I owe you an apology, Serafina, for the coldness of my welcome, for the terms of our arrangement. The confession seemed to cost him a great deal. Serafina's heart ached for him, for the immense pain he must have carried alone for so long. "Your Grace," she began, but he held up a hand. "Alistair," he said. "My name is Alistair." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "You deserve the truth. You live in this house of shadows, and you deserve to know why they are here," he told her then, his voice flat and devoid of self-pity. The story of his first marriage. Isabel had not been the serene saint of household lore. She had been vibrant and full of life, but she had also been afflicted by a profound melancholy, a darkness of the mind that would descend upon her without warning. In those times she would lock herself away, weeping for days, seeing no one. He, in his ignorance, had not understood the depth of her illness. He had thought it a weakness she could overcome. "The doctors called it female hysteria," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "They prescribed rest and quiet. Lady Beatrice, my cousin, she assured me it was merely a passing cloud, a woman's delicate sensibility. She encouraged me to be firm, not to indulge the moods a cold dread washed over Serafina as she began to understand. The day she died," he continued, his gaze fixed on the broken fountain, "we had argued. I had tried to jolly her out of one of her dark spells. I told her she had a duty to her daughter, to her position. I was impatient. I was a fool." His voice cracked on the last word. "I left for London that afternoon, angry. I received the message the next morning. She had gone to the balcony of her rooms in the West Wing." He paused, his jaw working. "She jumped. And Ilara was in the garden below. She saw. She has not spoken a word since the pieces fell into place with a sickening thud. The locked wing, the silent child, Ilara's terrified whisper, falling, and the Duke's crushing, all-consuming guilt. His coldness was not a lack of feeling, it was a penance. He had built a fortress of ice around his heart because he believed he had failed the one person he was supposed to protect. He blamed himself. And woven through his tragic confession was the thread of Lady Beatrice's influence, her dismissal of Isabel's suffering, her subtle manipulation that had fed his own ignorance and inaction. The revelation of her role in the tragedy was a twist of the knife, painting her not merely as a jealous rival, but as something far more sinister. Serafina felt a wave of overwhelming compassion. She saw the man before her not as the Iron Duke, but as a husband drowning in grief and a father paralyzed by guilt. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "Alistair," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "that was not your fault. It was an illness. You cannot blame yourself for not understanding something that no one understood." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, his eyes shimmering with a moisture he fought to control. For the first time, he did not pull away from her touch. He leaned into it, just slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the comfort she offered. The secret was out, the ghost named, the shadows given a source, and in the telling, in the sharing of his deepest wound, the last of the ice around his heart had finally begun to melt away. The confession hung in the air of the winter garden, stark and painful. It changed everything. Alistair's coldness was reframed, not as cruelty, but as a shield against a grief so profound he thought it would shatter him. Seraphina's role was no longer that of a convenient duchess, but of a confidant, the sole keeper of his devastating secret. Her touch on his arm was not rebuffed. Instead, he covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, almost desperate. It was the first time they had touched with any semblance of warmth, a connection forged in the crucible of his sorrow. "It is not enough to know the truth," Seraphina said softly, her gaze unwavering. "You cannot heal if you keep the wound locked away. Elara cannot heal. The West Wing. You must open it, Alistair, not to erase Isabel's memory, but to honor it, to let the light in." The thought clearly terrified him. The locked wing was his tomb of guilt, the one place he could contain the past. To open it felt like a betrayal, a desecration. He shook his head, pulling his hand away. "I cannot." "You will not be alone," she insisted gently. "We will do it together." For Elara, her words, her quiet strength, seemed to anchor him. He looked from her earnest face to the distant shuttered windows of the West Wing, then back again. He saw not pity in her eyes, but an empathetic resolve that mirrored his own buried desire for release. After a long, agonizing moment, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. The next morning he retrieved a heavy, ornate iron key from a locked drawer in his study. Together they walked the long, silent corridor to the West Wing. The air grew colder, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light from the hall windows. The double doors were imposing, their dark wood seeming to absorb the light. Alistair's hand trembled as he put the key in the lock. The sound of the mechanism turning was unnaturally loud, a groan of protest after 2 years of silence. He pushed the doors open, and they stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and dried lavender. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn, plunging the rooms into a deep twilight. It was as if time had stopped. A book lay open on a small table. A shawl was draped over the back of a chair. A silver-backed brush sat on the dressing table. A few long, dark strands of hair still caught in its bristles. It was a shrine to a life abruptly ended. Seraphina moved to the windows and, with a great heave, pulled back the curtains. Winter sunlight flooded the room, illuminating the thick layer of dust that coated every surface. The light seemed to chase the worst of the shadows into the corners. Alistair stood frozen in the center of the room, looking around as if seeing a ghost. "I had it all preserved," he whispered. I thought if I kept it just as she left it, a part of her would still be here." "She is not in these things, Alistair," Seraphina said gently, coming to his side. "She is in your memory. She is in Elara." As her eyes adjusted to the light, Seraphina's gaze fell upon a small, ornate writing desk. And on that desk, next to a silver inkwell, was a tiny, exquisitely crafted silver key, fashioned in the shape of a rose. Her breath caught. It was the key to the journal. She said nothing, but moved towards the desk. Alistair watched her, his expression confused. She picked up the key, its cold metal a shock against her skin. "What is it?" he asked. Instead of answering, she hurried from the room, her heart pounding. She returned moments later with the blue velvet journal. Without a word, she fitted the tiny key into the lock. It turned with a soft, satisfying click. Together they sat on the edge of a dust-covered chaise lounge, and Seraphina opened the book. The pages were filled with Isabel's elegant script. It was not the diary of a madwoman, it was the chronicle of a loving heart struggling against a terrible, encroaching darkness. She wrote of her deep, abiding love for her husband, her stoic, honorable Alistair. She wrote of her adoration for her daughter, her little Lark. But she also wrote of the fog that would descend, the leaden cloak of sorrow that she could not fight, an illness she knew was consuming her from the inside out. The final entry, dated the morning of her death, was almost illegible, the handwriting shaky and stained with tears. "The darkness is complete now, it has won. My dearest Alistair, please do not blame yourself. It is not your fault, it is a sickness in me. I am a broken thing. Tell my little Lark I love her." "I am so sorry." A single hot tear escaped Alistair's eye and fell onto the page, smudging the ink. The words were a posthumous absolution, a release from the prison of guilt he had built for himself. Isabel had not blamed him. She had loved him. Her final act had not been one of anger or despair at him, but a surrender to a disease she could no longer fight. He finally broke the iron control he had maintained for 2 years, shattering completely. He buried his face in his hands and wept, deep, ragged sobs of grief and guilt and, finally, of release. Seraphina did not speak. She simply put her arm around his shaking shoulders, offering her silent, steadfast presence. When the storm of his grief had passed, he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clearer than she had ever seen them. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the compassionate, resilient woman who had led him out of his self-imposed darkness. "Serafina," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears she hadn't realized she had shed for him, for Isabel, for all the lost years. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but something far more profound. It was a kiss of gratitude, of shared sorrow, of dawning hope. It was a kiss that sealed the end of a long, cold winter and promised the tentative, fragile beginning of a spring. In that dusty, sunlit room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, their marriage of convenience was transformed into something real, something true. The door to his heart, which he had sworn was closed forever, had just been unlocked. The opening of the west wing marked a profound turning point for the entire manor. Sunlight and fresh air were allowed to circulate through the long-abandoned rooms. Under Serafina's gentle guidance, the space was transformed. The heavy, mournful furniture was replaced with lighter pieces, the oppressive velvets with cheerful chintz. It was no longer a shrine to death, but a sunny, welcoming sitting room, a place for life. The change in Alistair was remarkable. The crushing weight of guilt had been lifted, and while his grief for Isabel remained, it was no longer a destructive force. It was a sad, sweet memory that he could now live with, rather than be imprisoned by. The harsh lines around his eyes and mouth softened. He began to smile, small, tentative smiles at first, which grew more frequent and genuine. He even displayed a dry, unexpected wit that made Serafina laugh, a sound that had been absent from the halls of Blackwood for far too long. He became a constant presence in her life and in Ilara's. He would join them for walks in the garden, his long strides easily keeping pace with their slower ones. He would read to Ilara in the evenings, his deep voice rumbling through the fairy tales, while Serafina sat nearby with her sewing, the picture of domestic tranquility she had never dared to imagine for herself. To mark the manor's reawakening, Alistair decided to host a grand ball, the first since before Isabel's death. It was a bold statement to society that the mourning was over, that Blackwood was rejoining the world. Invitations were sent, and the county buzzed with speculation about the Iron Duke's mysterious new duchess. The night of the ball, the manor was ablaze with light. Music and laughter echoed through the great hall, chasing away the last of the lingering shadows. Serafina, dressed in a gown of shimmering silver that Alistair had insisted on buying for her, stood beside him in the receiving line, a quiet confidence radiating from her. He could not seem to keep his eyes off her, his gaze filled with a warmth and admiration that was plain for all to see. But not everyone was pleased by this transformation. Lady Beatrice, relegated to the status of a mere guest, watched the proceedings with a look of venomous jealousy. Her position, her influence, had been utterly eclipsed. She saw Alistair's smiling face, the way he would lean in to murmur something to Serafina, the easy way his hand rested on the small of her back, and her resentment curdled into malice. She saw her opportunity when she cornered Lady Danbury, the county's most notorious and influential gossip, near the refreshment table. "A remarkable recovery, is it not?" Beatrice began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "One might almost think it unnatural. The Duke was utterly inconsolable for years, you know, and now this this daughter of a ruined baron arrives, and he is a new man." Lady Danbury's eyes lit up with avaricious interest. "Indeed. Oh, yes," Beatrice continued, leaning closer. "She has him completely bewitched. Erasing every trace of poor, dear Isabel, I hear she had the West Wing completely stripped. Such a lack of respect. She is a cunning, ambitious creature, make no mistake. She played on his grief to secure her position. An opportunist of the highest order, the poison spread quickly." Whispers began to circulate through the ballroom. Glances were cast towards Serafina, now tinged with suspicion and disapproval. She felt the atmosphere shift, the warmth of the room cooling as the rumors took root. She saw the assessing looks, the veiled whispers behind fans, and a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Alistair, who had been speaking to a neighbor, noticed the change in her expression. "What is it?" he murmured, his brow furrowed with concern. Before she could answer, his gaze was drawn to the source of the whispers, his cousin, holding court with a small group of avid listeners. The expression on Beatrice's face was one of triumphant malice. He understood in an instant. An icy fury, the likes of which Serafina had never seen, settled over his features. It was the return of the Iron Duke. But this time his coldness was not born of grief, but of a white-hot, protective rage. He did not raise his voice. He simply took Serafina's hand, led her to the center of the ballroom floor, and raised his other hand for silence. The music faltered and died. The chatter ceased. Every eye in the room turned to them. "My apologies for the interruption," he began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the vast room. "It has come to my attention that some malicious falsehoods are being circulated this evening." "Allow me to correct them." He turned his piercing gaze directly on Lady Beatrice, who paled under his scrutiny. "My cousin, Lady Beatrice, has for too long mistaken my grief for weakness and my silence for acquiescence. She will be leaving Blackwood Manor tomorrow morning. Permanently, a collective gasp went through the crowd. Beatrice looked as though she had been struck. Alistair then turned his attention back to the assembled guests, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "For 2 years, this house and my heart have been entombed in darkness and grief. I saw no way out. I was lost. And then this woman," he squeezed Seraphina's hand, his eyes locking with hers, his love and devotion a palpable force. "This incredible woman came into my life. She did not erase the memory of my late wife. She honored it by teaching me how to live again. She brought light where there was shadow, kindness where there was despair, and she healed not only my child but me. She is not an opportunist. She is the soul of this house. She is the keeper of my heart. She is my wife, my duchess, and the greatest gift I have ever received." The declaration, so public, so passionate, so utterly unequivocal, left the room in stunned silence. Seraphina's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with a love so powerful it felt as though it might burst. And then a small figure broke the tableau. Ilara, who had been watching from the top of the grand staircase with her new kind-faced governess, began to walk slowly down the steps. She was dressed in a pretty party frock of pale blue silk. She did not stop until she reached the center of the room. She walked directly to Seraphina, ignoring the hundreds of staring eyes. She reached up and took Seraphina's free hand in her own. She looked up into Seraphina's face, her own dark eyes clear and shining. And then, in the utter silence of the ballroom, she spoke her first clear, complete word to her new mother. "Mamma," she said, her voice small but perfectly clear. The sound broke the spell. It was a sound of healing, of love, of a family made whole. Alistair's face crumpled with emotion as he knelt and wrapped both his wife and his daughter in his arms. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer had the power to harm them. Their future, bright and full of promise, had just begun. The following spring, the rose garden burst into a riot of color and fragrance. The old resilient bushes that Seraphina had so painstakingly nurtured had rewarded her efforts with a profusion of blooms, velvet crimson, delicate blush pink, and creamy white. The air was sweet with their scent, and the sound of bees humming amongst the petals was a constant, gentle music. Life at Blackwood Manor was as transformed as the garden. Laughter was now a common sound in its halls, the heavy draperies had been thrown back, and sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating rooms that were filled with warmth and life. The ghost of sorrow had been banished, replaced by a quiet, enduring happiness. Lady Beatrice was gone, a bitter memory that faded with each passing day. The whispers of society had been silenced by the Duke's unwavering and public devotion to his wife. They had found their own world within the walls of the estate, a sanctuary built on a foundation of shared healing and profound love. One perfect afternoon in late June, Seraphina, Alistair, and Ilara were walking the newly restored garden paths. Ilara, whose silence had given way to a steady stream of cheerful, inquisitive chatter, ran ahead, chasing a cabbage-white butterfly that danced from rose to rose. Her laughter, clear and bright, was the most beautiful sound in the world to Seraphina and Alistair. Alistair took Seraphina's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He had become so comfortable with these small, affectionate gestures, yet each one still sent a thrill of quiet joy through her. "Do you remember the first day we met?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "In that cold, dreadful solicitor's office?" "How could I forget?" she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You were terrifying," he chuckled, a rich, warm sound. "I was a fool, a broken, arrogant fool. I said things to you that day, words I have regretted every moment since." He stopped walking and turned to face her. His grey eyes, no longer the color of a winter sky but of warm summer slate, were filled with an emotion so deep it made her breath catch. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I told you that you would manage my household and be a mother to my daughter," he said softly, his gaze intense. "And you have done both with more grace and wisdom than I could have ever imagined. But then I said the cruelest thing of all." He paused, his expression tender and full of remorse. "I told you that you would never enter my heart, that the door was closed forever." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "I was so wrong, my love. So profoundly wrong. You did not simply enter my heart. You rebuilt it from the ruins. You planted a garden in its ashes. You are my heart, Serafina. You and that little girl chasing butterflies. Everything that I am, everything that is good in my life, I owe to you. He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss filled with all the love and gratitude that words could not express. It was a kiss of promises kept and a future filled with hope. When they finally broke apart, Ilara came running back to them, her hands full of fallen rose petals. For you, Mamma, she said, showering them over Serafina's head. Serafina laughed, brushing the petals from her hair, her heart so full it felt boundless. Alistair wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as they watched their daughter. The sun was warm on their faces, the scent of roses was all around them, and the future stretched before them, as bright and beautiful as the garden they had brought back to life together. The Iron Duke was no more, and in his place stood a husband and father whose love was as strong and enduring as the ancient stones of his home. Dear listener, how often do we build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from past hurts? Like the Duke of Blackwood, we may believe that closing ourselves off is a sign of strength, a necessary defense against a world that has caused us pain. We might tell ourselves and others that certain doors are closed forever, that we are beyond the reach of love or healing. But this story reminds us that the most resilient things in nature and in the human heart are not those that are the most rigid, but those that can learn to open again to the light. Serafina did not try to tear down the Duke's walls with force. She did not make demands or issue ultimatums. Instead, she simply began to tend a neglected garden. She brought her quiet, patient, and persistent care to a small corner of his world, expecting nothing in return. Her compassion was a gentle, steady warmth like the spring sun that slowly, patiently thawed the ice around his heart. She showed him that true strength lies not in impenetrable defenses, but in the vulnerability it takes to let someone in, to share our deepest wounds, and to trust that healing is possible. Perhaps there is a neglected garden in your own life, or in the life of someone you care about, a place of past hurt that has been left to thorns and ruin. Maybe the lesson from Blackwood Manor is not to attack the walls, but to find a small patch of earth and begin, quietly and patiently, to cultivate something beautiful. For it is often in the gentle, selfless act of nurturing life and offering kindness without condition that the most fortified hearts finally, miraculously, find a reason to open their doors once more. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these tales of love and redemption. Until next time,